Many leaders specialize in one industry, but others try their hand at leading vastly different firms, whether they're the world's largest shipping company or a German technology giant. Jim Hagemann Snabe is one of the latter. As chairman of both Siemens and Maersk, the Danish businessman is one of Europe's most prominent industrialists. He spent most of his career at SAP, starting as a trainee in 1990 before rising through the ranks to become co-chief executive. Snabe built his career on leading in the technology space. When Siemens tapped him as chairman, the company highlighted his extensive experience in the field. So what skills are needed to lead companies as different as Maersk and Siemens? Today, on Leaders with Lacqua, we meet Jim Hagemann Snabe. Jim Snabe, thank you so much for joining us on Leaders with Lacqua. What do you see the role of the chairman or the chairwoman compared to a chief executive in 2021?
Well, that's a great question. Again, I've tried both roles. I normally make the joke that as a CEO, you're supposed to answer many questions to your board, and as a chairman, you don't have to. You're just there to ask the questions in the right sequence. So, in that sense, I do enjoy being able to ask now the questions. But if I'm right that we live in a world where a constant reinvention becomes the core capability of an organization to be successful over time, then of course the chairman and the board plays an important role in allowing the executive team to experiment, to not make too many detailed plans, to be overly ambitious about where they could go. And traditionally, that's not the way the board has worked. Many boards spend way too much time looking back. They spend time looking at last quarter's report, and it's done. They celebrate when the company reaches its budget. Mm-hmm. And I ask myself, well, what if it's the wrong budget? What if the world was exponential and you achieved a linear budget? And there's way too little time in the boardroom, in many boards, to discuss the experiments that could define the future. So in my boardrooms, we certainly spend more time discussing the future than the past. I often say that we'll deal with the past until lunch, and after lunch we'll deal with the future, and then it's a little bit up to management to discuss when to have lunch. Hopefully we don't have lunch too late. And I really welcome an honest conversation in the boardroom. I often say that no news is bad news, that bad news is good news, because with bad news you can make change happen. Yeah. And good news is no news. We don't have to debate the good stuff. I mean, we should debate how can we be better, which experiments matter the most. So,
Jim,
yeah, you can
as a chair, if you're asking questions, how many questions do you ask about sustainability? How many questions do you ask about diversity?
I ask a lot of questions. For me, that's an integral part of your strategy. So it's not let's have sustainability as a topic. No, it starts with sustainability in your strategy. I think we're at that inflection point now in history where sustainability used to be a separate report done by a separate department. And it was really funded by the profits the company makes. So it's how you spend your profits to do good in the world. And I think we're at an inflection point where it's becoming how you make your money. So when Siemens increases its market share in wind turbines, we are making money on the transition of energy systems from fossil to renewable. And the more we do that, the more we also help the world become more sustainable and make a better business. And so if sustainability becomes how you make money, where diversity also fits in, because if you believe in innovation, and innovation is really fueled by diverse thought and background and ideas, then of course diverse teams becomes a necessity in order to deliver on innovation. Then suddenly it's a strategy conversation that leads to a sustainable portfolio that accelerates sustainable future. And it's a strategy conversation that leads to a diverse team, not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of geography and backgrounds. I've seen that in the companies that I worked, because they're all global, and I can only say my best moments is in a diverse team thinking about how we can create products that make the world more sustainable.
Has a pandemic changed those conversations? So has it accelerated them?
I know the pandemic, in one sense, of course, a pretty devastating and tragic moment, but one that we could have foreseen. So first reflection is we were unprepared, and shame on us. We better be better prepared next time. Secondly, if there's anything good about the pandemic, it is really that it's demonstrated our incredible ability to drive change. Things that used to take months or even years, we could do in weeks. I mean, here we are in a virtual setting of an interview. That was almost impossible before. And I conduct my board meetings now virtually as well when I have to. And so suddenly we learned a new skill that we all knew we had to learn. So the question is really, what comes after the pandemic? And I'm a strong believer that we need to use that crisis to accelerate the future we had in mind. We had a long discussion in Davos, January 2020. Can we afford this shift to a sustainable future? And now we have all of this money flowing into recovery. And so now we could actually accelerate that future, invest in sustainable energies, transportation systems, et cetera, et cetera. We have, I think, clearly seen the acceleration of digital adoption in our lives, in the way we work. So how do we accelerate that, but in a responsible way? And my biggest concern is actually not so much the agenda around sustainability or digital. I'm sure they will thrive coming out of the crisis. My concern is around globalization. Are we reversing globalization because of this?
No.
Do we think that building borders is a solution? I don't. I think globalization is creating enormous value, and we need to create more resilient supply chains, but not only local supply chains.
Jim, how has the pandemic changed you as a leader?
It has certainly made me understand that the thoughts also described in my leadership model, Dreams in Detail, which is really about this constant ability to constantly reinvent an organization, has proven to be even more relevant. I thought the disruption was coming through technology, and suddenly we add a dimension, which is the pandemic that drives change. I see how, having come far in the reinvention of large companies like Siemens and Maersk, helped manage the pandemic and come out stronger from the pandemic. And the core assumption that I've always had in my leadership is that human beings are so capable if you only let them. And for 200 years of industrialization, we haven't let them. We made plans and details and told them what to do and measured them to do exactly that. And man, can people be more creative if you let them find a way. Be clear about where we're going. The dream has to be accurate. It has to be clear. It has to be meaningful. It has to be logical and emotional. And you have to build the capabilities necessary in order to unfold that dream. That's what I call the details. What do we need to be world-class at? And how do we accelerate the capability development in those areas, which is really about building human talent. And then you let go somehow and allow people to unleash their human creativity to find the best way to that future.
Up next, the trends of tomorrow. What does Jim Hagemann Snabe see as the biggest challenges for future businesses?
You see companies like Siemens or Moller Maersk mastering the physical world, but now moving into the digital world.
As chairman of two of Europe's biggest companies, Jim Hagemann Snabe knows about leadership. And in his book, Dreams and Details, he writes about what's needed to succeed. Dreams, inspiring people to be part of something meaningful, and the little details that can transform an organization from the inside out. And the leader that he says embodies these qualities? Tesla founder and chief executive Elon Musk, whose bold ideas and vision have made him one of the world's richest men. But what are the trends of tomorrow for those of us who haven't founded SpaceX, and what lessons are there to learn? How do you look at the trends of tomorrow? How difficult is it to see how we'll make things, right, for industrial company, or how we'll consume things if you're in IT?
Well, I think, first of all, the first wave of let's say, value creation in this digital era was really with the pure digital players. We've seen an enormous value creation, and I was part of that with SAP, an incredible journey. But I'm convinced now that the next phase will be the combination of hardware and software, so to say. At the end of the day, we'll still have physical things. We'll have physical food and physical transportation and physical buildings, and so when you begin to add a digital dimension to a physical world, then you get this dilemma of two speeds. You have the software, which is innovating at a very high pace, and the physical parts, which are innovating at a slower pace. And the challenge is really to combine the two. I believe that if you master that, we can create significantly more value than pure play technology or software companies can. And that's a little bit what I bet on also with my shift from the software industry to the real industry, so to say.
Jim, can you give me a concrete example of where you saw that shift?
Yeah, I mean, the first shift we've seen has really been in the consumer world. So largely about connecting with people in new ways, also entertaining people in new ways. So we've seen a lot of such value creation with some of the tech giants that we know today that created platforms, and with platforms comes enormous amount of innovation on top. And now we begin to see the battle, which is the combination of hardware and software. I think the first company to really do that was Apple, who argued if I master both, I can create a better experience for my customer. We see the tech companies, Google, Microsoft, now moving into hardware because they want to combine the two. And you see companies like Siemens or A.P. Moller-Maersk mastering the physical world, but now moving into the digital world. So, for instance, when we add a digital dimension to a train, we are able to optimize the service of that train. And ideally, you buy fewer trains because we can make the trains deliver a network service with the same amount of passengers because we keep the trains up and running. We are preventive in the maintenance. Same is true for a wind turbine. We read the data from sensors on the turbine and can keep it running most of the time. And with that, of course, we create more value. And in the transportation industry, often customers spend more money on paperwork than they do actually moving the container. And so also there we're digitizing the physical paperwork in order to create more transparency and simplicity and an ease of consumption for customers. That's really where the value comes in. Tesla is a good example of a hardware, which is a car combined with a software. And if you look at the valuation of Tesla today, it's clearly not an automotive company. It's a technology company that has mastered the two worlds out of one hand.
With unconventional leadership, I would say, at the top of Tesla. Yes. What does Elon Musk teach you about leadership?
Well, he certainly dreams big. And I think that's one of my arguments, that you can't have mediocre plans because you want to achieve your plan. And it's really hard to get exponential plans approved by the board. So I think you need to exchange that plan. The time of the detailed business plan is over, because it's only valid if you can predict the future. And I don't think you can predict the future anymore. Technologies are disrupting any industry right now, and nobody can predict the next move. So you actually shift the leadership model from being managing according to plans into having very ambitious dreams about future state and a role your company can play in that. Elon Musk's vision was not just to build an electric car, it was to reinvent transportation of human beings in a sustainable way. And then you take a different approach because it's such a meaningful, big dream that you can inspire people in your company, stakeholders around your company, and create enormous value. So that I think is the first recommendation or learning that I have is you've got to be extremely ambitious in your leadership. Otherwise, it'll be mediocre and you won't be able to reinvent the company.
Jim, in your book, Dreams and Details, is that the premise of what you think leadership will be in the future? Dream big and disrupt?
Yes, I think so. I think we're at a moment in history now where the time of disruption happens much more frequently. If I use my incredible opportunity at SAP, I started there as a trainee in 1990, so it's some years ago. And moved up into that organization, became the co-CEO 20 years later in 2010 with my good friend and colleague, Bill McDermott. And in that period of time, I mean, the company was founded in 72 by 5 people who had an idea of disrupting the tech industry with a category called enterprise software. Nobody believed them then. They created SAP, and look where it is today. Then 20 years later, in 92, exactly 20 years later, they came out with a new version of that software, which was geared around, the death of the mainframe, so to say, and the invention of networked computers. So that was 20 years between the disruptions, and the reinvention was driven from a position of strength. Then in 2000, the internet became really the infrastructure of choice, and the company reinvented itself again. And when I was asked to take on the co-CEO role with Bill McDermott, the intent was to reinvent again. So you see how the time between each of these reinventions just gets shorter and shorter. From 20 years in the first wave, it was actually from 2002 to 2010, and the last only 8 years between the reinventions. And the reinvention is going on again now at Siemens, 5 years later. So if that's the premise we live in, because digital has entered all industries, then the skill of a leader moves from being able to predict mediocre outcomes in business plans to enable an organization to be agile, understand and predict future patterns, and react faster to that than any competitor out there.
Up next, we talk big questions facing big tech.
How do we use data without taking people's privacies away?
Technology has made the world a better connected place and changed the way people live, shop, and communicate. But tech giants haven't always had a spotless reputation. Between data breaches, the mishandling of private information, and fake accounts linked to elections, big tech has fallen short of its ideals, sparking the attention of regulators across the globe. Jim Hagemann Snabe is calling for technology to be more responsible. His book, Tech for Life, argues that it's vital to make sure that these platforms work for everyone without creating monopolies or eroding civil liberty. He says businesses need to concentrate on both profit and purpose. You talk also quite often about irresponsible digitalization. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it is a fact that we have now gotten all of these new technologies. The internet was born, and the World Wide Web was born in 1989. It was intended to share research results among researchers and became this opportunity to distribute information, and we're putting more and more weight on that internet. In parallel to that, we have now added data from consumers, and now we're in the industrial era of digitization, so now we're adding data from things, from cars, from mobile phones, from sensors on wind turbines, from everything. And with that, suddenly we have an enormous intelligence about what's going on in this world. And we begin to see how some companies are misusing that access to information. And so I'm asking myself three questions that I think are critical in a responsible use of technology. Number one, how do we use data without taking people's privacies away? Number two, how do we use platforms without creating monopolies that control markets? And number three, which I think is the big challenge ahead of us, how do we use AI, artificial intelligence, in a way where we don't lose control, but have a human-centric approach to the use of such a powerful technology? And that, for me, the answer to those three questions is responsible use of technology. And we don't see that in all companies today.
That's probably an understatement. Who should be in charge of setting the tone? Who should be in charge of making sure that the 3 points you addressed are adhered to?
That is a super good question. And the issue is that, of course, in the past, we would expect policymakers to make policies that would ensure a responsible use of a technology. It's always been the case that when technology comes, you can overuse it, so to say, and then it becomes dangerous. Whether that's a car that suddenly drives too fast and you need to put limitations on it, or it's a energy source like nuclear, which can also be used as a weapon, or it's data, which can also be misused. The issue is that in the digital world, the innovation pace is so high that I think it's naive to believe that the policymakers can keep up and guard that. So I'm actually suggesting in a book which I call Tech for Life, that it is the ones building technology, it is the companies using technology that should stop for a moment and ask themselves these three questions and make sure that we don't use technology for what it can be used for, but what we want it to be used for. I mean, I often use the examples of the real world. When I mail a letter with a physical mail company, not so often anymore, but when I do expect that they don't open my letter. They just transport it. And so why are we accepting that in the digital world where we're trying to get the same kind of communication going, it's an email, why is it suddenly acceptable that the mailman opens my letter to better understand my interests? It's totally unacceptable.
But often, Jim, I guess it's because we don't understand, right? We don't really know what the technology we use goes to. So is it up to regulators or is it up to politicians to enforce it?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's people who work with technology. As I said, there has to be a revolution, kind of a bottom up. It starts with people programming, saying, well, is that a reasonable way of using technology, even if I could? Then, of course, we need some regulation. But see, we don't want to slow the pace of innovation down. So I'm also a little bit hesitant to not put too many restrictions on. We can't foresee how the technology will be used. So if we put too many restrictions on, we may lose the opportunity, for instance, to solve cancer, because that's access to data thing. And if we limit that too much, we may not be able to. So what if it starts with responsible use for anyone who's involved with technology?
Jim Snabe, thank you so much for joining us on Leaders with Lacqua.